So we're delighted to be back with our seminar series. We are even more delighted to be welcoming Dr. Ellie Suh to deliver the seminar today. Ellie is currently a postdoctoral research fellow at Rees Centre, University of Oxford, having completed her PhD at LSE under the supervision of the late Sir John Hills. Ellie is a quantitative researcher with substantive interests in people, money and society, and her research has a strong focus on the social aspects of economic behaviour and wealth inequality. Ellie's followed Chasm's work for many years, so we're delighted to welcome her here, as I say, to give this seminar today. But even more delighted and excited to announce that Ellie will be joining the Chasm team next year as Chasm Research Fellow, so we couldn't be happier about that, so welcome, Ellie. Ellie is currently arranging a working group connecting academics and those in the wealth and assets team at the ONS, focusing on the concept of financial resilience. So before we started the presentation today, we just wanted to let you know about that and to say that if anybody's interested in that, interested in joining or just finding out a bit more, then please do contact Ellie. Her email address will be on her presentation, but perhaps Ellie, you can put it in the chat as well. Okay, so we have about half an hour presentation. Ellie will speak for about half an hour, and then we will, as normal, have time for questions. So I think without further ado, and if everything's okay with you, Ellie, I'm going to hand over.
Great, thank you very much, Liz. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much for having me today. As Louise introduced, I'm Ellie Suh, a postdoc researcher at University of Oxford, and this presentation today is actually based on my doctoral study at the LSE, and the presentation is titled Financial Resilience and its Role in Retirement Saving, the Case for the Younger Half of the Working Age Population in Britain. So I'll start with a little bit of background around the pension landscape and recent developments in the recent couple of decades, and the gaps that I have identified in the retirement saving literature and research question. And I will briefly explain how I approach the financial resilience in the context of retirement saving before going into analytical strategy. I will explain a little bit of the theoretical framework before introducing data and methods. Then we will go into the findings from the overall findings, and I will summarize that, what it means, and explain those findings based on two key hypotheses that I will focus on in this presentation. I will then conclude with some policy implications of my findings, then welcome questions and comments afterwards. Okay, I'm sure some of the audience will be already familiar with what's happened in the pension landscape in the couple of decades. And here we are looking at it from the younger generation's perspective. The younger generation, I refer to those in their 30s and 40s. And throughout the presentation, I'll be referring to them as younger generation or younger adults and so on. So for this population, what has changed in the couple of decades is that the roles that the state and the workplace pension scheme used to play, they used to play a much larger role than currently for the previous generations. But for the younger generation, the roles have reduced, and this gap is expected to be filled by increase in the private retirement saving. So then the role of individual has become greater. The recent changes, such as the state pension now is covering more people, providing more pension, the pension income for more wider group of society, which is great. But generosity for some has reduced, which means that certainty has become a little bit of an issue for some, and generosity. In the work pension aspect, we very well know that most of the private sector have moved on now to defined contribution from defined benefit, which was much more generous for some, of course. And this gap is, to an extent, will be filled by the introduction of automatic enrollment, and it's going quite strong so far. But these changes collectively mean that there are generally more risks involved in accumulating and generating retirement income for the younger generation, and that as a result, what we see is that there is a much less clear-cut distinction between what we used to consider as a retirement saving and what we might now consider wealth accumulation, general saving over a life course of someone's life. So in essence, what it actually means is that, as I mentioned earlier, the individuals now carry greater responsibility to save for their future, and they are strongly encouraged to save more from earlier on. So it becomes more important for researchers like us to understand how people save actually then. Despite this importance, there is a general lack of evidence on how people save outside of workplace pension scheme or the national insurance contribution that automatically occurs. And so naturally the questions are, who are really saving then among those in their 30s and 40s? And if we can identify the savers, is there any difference between the saver and savers and dissavers? Sorry, the non-savers. And is the difference systematic? These are actually quite typical retirement saving questions and could be approached typically in the previous literature either way. Two very prominent arguments. The first strand of argument is that young people cannot save because they don't have enough economic resources. So this actually is based on the traditional economic theories such as life cycle or permanent income hypothesis, that at younger age, we don't have enough financial resources to be able to save for later, because retirement saving is indeed actually is consumption smoothing over the lifetime. And instead of actually thinking about saving, we should be borrowing against the future income and save when our income actually peaks at later stage in somewhere late 40s and mid 50s. On the other side of the camp, we have the psychologists and some economic psychologists who say that young people don't want to save really, that we won't save due to some psychological factors. We fail to recognize the benefit of saving for the future. So that's the argument of the short-sightedness in a way, or that we simply want to enjoy today rather than saving for later. So these are the two arguments coming from in relation to time perspective. So whether it's about myopia, focusing on the immediate gratification as opposed to the long-term benefit, or whether we approach this according to the rational theory of hyperbolic discounting, typically used in economics. Now, reading these studies, there are some gaps that I have identified. Well, the thing is, if you're thinking about the discretionary nature of the retirement saving that we need to know more about, the reality of retirement saving hasn't been sufficiently reflected in the previous studies. There has been an overemphasis on income or psychological traits, but less about how people actually make saving decisions. And as a result, we don't know very much about how individuals might decide and what sort of interaction may be going on between the individual's psychosocial, what I call internal factors, and socioeconomic external factors. And these interactions have been typically overlooked. We haven't actually studied very much about it. Another gap that I've identified is that age is understood as a number. And it's a very important point because it's actually a temporal measure between now and the time of retirement. But this has been understood and tested in many of the quantitative studies in the line of chronological aging, as if the aging is linear as the age increases. So as a result, we have not paid enough attention on this social aspect of what it means for the younger generation to grow older, the aspirations that we might have, or like the stages of life and the milestone life events that are associated to them. Forming partnership, getting married, moving into our first home, growing family, these events are often overlooked. So these two gaps I have identified, I have framed around the two major hypotheses that I will focus on this presentation. The first refers to the role of financial resilience. And second is what I call social aging And this is basically how we will be walking through the presentation today. Before we move on to the analysis, let's talk a little bit about how I conceptualized financial resilience. There has been an increasing interest in trying to understand financial resilience because it's very important in understanding financial well-being. As Professor Elaine Kempson said in one of the books Forward, she has very nicely explained how this actually is a very important aspect that we need to consider in relation to financial inclusion, financial literacy, and financial capability studies that we have done in the past decades. Financial resilience in previous studies has been mainly discussed in two different approaches, let's say. The first approach is more towards this ability to bounce back from adverse events. In my opinion, it's rather narrowly defined. It's passive and rather reactive. It focuses on individuals' ability to ensure their financial well-being and increase their financial, let's say, capability. And studies in this area indeed focus on actually improving financial literacy or saving capacity to increase one's financial resilience. The second approach views financial resilience as more of an ability to access and draw on internal capabilities and external resources in time of adversity. This is basically the phrase that Salignac and colleagues used to explain what it actually means in their study. And in this approach, I think the financial resilience is more broadly defined and more proactive because it recognizes the internal capabilities, and interactive because there is a role of external resources on it. So it views that the ability to manage one's finance can be influenced by external factors. So there are lots of studies here, but as I mentioned, one of the probably most important studies that if anyone wants to look at would be the work by Salignac and colleagues published in 2019. So I take more the second approach, and in the retirement saving context, I have defined financial resilience as an indicator for today's financial behavior that gives us an idea of an extent of individuals' economic autonomy. So then what I do here to do that is to recognize the importance of the interaction between the psychosocial, the internal factors that I have mentioned earlier, and the socioeconomic factors that individuals do not have direct control over. And understanding these dynamics is a key to understanding financial resilience. Okay, we can now go into the analytical strategy. Because this study is about decision-making process, I will introduce the model that actually explains the decision-making process that I have modified before actually going into the daytime method. In the daytime method, I will focus on how I actually measure financial resilience, apart from anything, given time constraints, and then we'll move on to the findings afterwards. Okay, this is looking quite complicated, but not as bad as it will look, I promise. So this is what I have mapped, what I call the quantitative mapping of retirement saving based on the model of financial planning. This is actually a group of psychologists, American psychologists, who actually built this model. And I have actually made minor modifications to make it suitable for the younger generation, the younger generation's discretionary retirement saving, and to account for the additional factors that are important in the current environment for that generation. So if we start from the bottom half of the graph, in the white box, we have internal factors, attitudinal and behavioral factors. Here we have, so basically what model is saying is that if someone is forward-looking, has a higher level of future orientation, this person is more likely to be financially resilient and also more likely to have thought about funding retirement. And these two qualities actually motivate them to have more pension-oriented financial knowledge. This will in turn increase the confidence in how they are saving for retirement, as well as gives a higher chance of actually them being retirement saver. So these are the internal dynamics. If you look at the upper part where the gray box comes in, these are the what I call external factors. And this actually includes very easily to understand demographic characteristics, so age and gender, household structure sometimes. In socioeconomic circumstances, I include household income, home ownership, and intergenerational transfers, because these are very important for the younger generation in Britain today. And excuse me, as indicators of workplace pension schemes, I distinguish defined benefit and defined contribution schemes. Okay, I use Wealth and Assets Survey, WAS, fourth wave that was carried out between July 2012 and June 2014. The reason that I have used this specific wave was because it coincided with the introduction of automatic enrollment, and there were lots of campaigns being carried out by the government to increase the awareness of the introduction of AE. And therefore, the survey included a question about AE that I am using in the model. Okay, this is the reason why I've chosen the fourth wave, even though it's in very well past. I have included adults aged between 30 and 49 who are employed, male and females. In terms of analysis, I have used structure equation modeling. Briefly to explain, this is different from the typical regression analysis because it has 3 parts to it, 2 parts typically, and I have extended to 3 parts. It contains the measurement model that allows me to measure the attitudinal concepts that are otherwise difficult to measure. So for instance, the way that we will measure future orientation or financial resilience will be very different from the way that we measure someone's age or the highest educational qualifications. So the measurement model, I use facts analysis to actually construct what I call what's called latent variables, and called financial resilience, future orientation, and financial knowledge. Once these latent variables are constructed, then I look at the relationship among them and also the outcome variable, the retirement saver. So the retirement saver is identified anyone who has saved in the past 2 years with the idea that, yes, this money is going to fund my retirement, but this saving is outside their pension or the NI contribution. So this structural part then lets me understand the relationship amongst the latent variables as well as with covariates, so with demographic and socioeconomic characteristics. Then I took this model further to analyze the difference between men and women, but this is not the focus of this presentation. So unless there is a question, we will just skip to the next part. Okay, so this is basically the hypothesized measurement model. So these are the 3 latent variables that I have hypothesized to construct, and those are presented in circles, so yellow, orange, and blue. And here we will focus on the financial resilience on the yellow part. I have used 5 survey questions from Wealth and Assets Survey, and these are presented in the yellow boxes on the left or the green boxes. So these are questions, frequency of running out of money at the end of the period, difficult keeping up with bills and financial commitments, duration capable of sustaining oneself in case of income loss, I think in this case was a quarter of income loss, tendency to make sure money is left at the end of each period, and tendency to buy on credit rather than wait and save to be able to buy it. The last 2 questions are actually also represented by future orientation, and that's why they are in green rather than complete yellow, called crossroading in the structure equation model language, basically. So these are the hypothesized structure. And now we will go into findings and show you how that actually came out and what it actually meant in overall model. But I will show you, as I will share the summary of findings first before actually going into the results for the specific hypothesis that we talked about. Okay, we just talked about the structure of financial resilience. Here, the measurement model is only shown for the financial resilience. So there are other parts of measurement model that I'm not showing here. So here, what I am saying is that financial resilience explains these 5 different survey questions, and how people answer these questions would differ between the level of their financial resilience, which we cannot directly measure, but can have an idea of through this model. So this is basically the idea. The quality of model then is judged by the combination of the numbers that's written on the bottom of the box. These are called loadings. So there's a correlation between, we can understand as the coefficients between financial resilience and this survey question. So financial resilience explains how people are going to answer this survey question. These are in relative terms. So if we anchor that scale as 1 for the third question, these are 0.8, 0.9, 0.7 are the relative scales that financial resilience contribute to explaining each survey question. So here we can see that these are fairly good structure. They all more or less contribute quite a lot. They are explained quite a lot by financial resilience, except for the last item, perhaps, that it's 0.2, so it's unignorable in the sense that if I ignored it, the model fit will not be as good, but still relevant. So it's still relevant, but not as strongly as the other 4 questions. So these are the loading aspect of the quality of the model. On the other hand, we can also look at the goodness of fit statistics written on the top left-hand side of the corner. The important point here that I'd like to point out is that, yes, the financial resilience explains these 5 survey questions, the pattern in how people answer these 5 questions. Important point to note here is that income has direct effect on some of them. So we cannot ignore how income is important, explaining even after we have accounted for the structure of the financial resilience, especially for the last 3 questions. We do have the relationship, so income explains financial resilience. It's a predictor for the level of financial resilience, and the coefficient correlation here, 0.5, is fairly strong. So we can read it as a more or less regression coefficient here. And because this is negative values here, in the end, the total effect, this is direct effect, and this is indirect effect going to that question, should be then accounted for. So what it means is that financial resilience, yes, is a concept that we can actually understand from how people answer these survey questions, but that's not independent. That's very much depending on the level of income. And that some aspect of financial resilience is very, very closely tied to income. I think this is a very important point. I'll tell you why. Okay, let's put aside the findings of the measurement model for now and talk about what I found overall in this study. So I have shown you the mapping earlier, internal and external factors in boxes and with lots of arrows. So that's the basically modeling. I will show you the results afterwards. What did I find? Well, overall finding just suggests that it's the retirement discretionary retirement saving for the younger generation is actually much more complex than just can save or won't save. So we cannot just rely on income to explain everything, and we cannot rely on myopia to explain everything. Let's start with very basic findings. Less than 1 in 10 actually saved for retirement outside of work and state pension schemes. This is a very low level of saving, which is actually quite concerning. If we go into a little bit more into the hypothesis testing that we looked at earlier, the gaps in the literature, the individual's current behavioral tendency, which I termed as financial resilience in this study, is the strongest predictor controlling for other variables in the model for identifying retirement saver. Now, okay, so does that then mean that it's up to people to decide whether they save or not? No, because we have just now seen in the measurement model, but also I will show you later, income, home ownership, and additional availability of additional resources through intergenerational transfers like inheritance or cash gifts or informal loans are very closely related to individuals' level of financial resilience. So that there is this interaction that I've mentioned coming into play here. So another set of interesting finding is regarding social aging. We have previously thought about age as like a linear progression towards retirement, and how that actually, let's say, motivates or pressures individuals to save more. But in my study, it's found that actually the combinations of the social and economic arrangement that give us the idea where the individuals are in the life stages can be more powerful explanation. It provides more powerful explanation compared to the age as just a chronological measure. So I will go into the details shortly. So this is the graphical representation of the hypothesis 1, which was concerning the role of financial resilience here, the decision-making and behavioral indicator here. So I have mentioned earlier that the previous studies have overemphasized on the role of income. And yes, you will have a direct income, but I expect that there is it also affects how individuals make decisions, therefore indirectly also influences how people decide to save or not to save for retirement. The findings show that actually, yes, income is very closely related. We have seen that from the measurement model. And controlling for other variables, financial resilience is the strongest predictor to identify the retirement saver. And now what is important to note here is that income, controlling for financial resilience and other variables, income no longer has direct association to the retirement saving outcomes. So this is a very important finding, I think, is that in discretionary retirement saving, the role of financial resilience is very important. Yes, it is correlated to income. Nonetheless, accounting for that, income actually doesn't explain very much at all whether one saves or not. This is the outcome of the, this is the collection of finding graphically represented. And we are only going to look at the colored part of it. So this is showing that this 0.6 that we have seen just now is the strongest predictor because it's larger than any of the figures that we see here internally. Now, this doesn't mean that it's entirely up to financial resilience, which is more considered to be an internal factor sort of measure. No, because we can see here that being a homeowner and having a higher household income, equivalized income, is very strongly associated with the level of financial resilience. So there's an aspect to financial resilience which the individuals do not have direct control over. I think this is a very interesting finding. The second hypothesis and finding is around the chronological aging and social aging. So I have expected that, well, okay, yes, the age is important because it's a temporal measure, but we can also think about the social aspects of aging as we imagine. And my findings suggest that actually, yes, the life stages reflected in the economic and social arrangements explain to an extent more than age itself when we try to understand whether one has thought about saving for retirement or not. Again, we will only focus on the colored path. Here is whether one has thought about funding retirement or not. When I didn't have these variables, so no external factors, so demographic and socioeconomic factors, and had only internal factors in the model, financial resilience predicted whether someone has thought about funding retirement or not. So by looking at how people answer those 5 questions, we could predict to an extent whether one has thought about retirement saving or not, therefore linked to identifying a retirement saver. But once I have put these indicators in the model, the explanation power here, explanatory power, has disappeared. What does that mean? It means that these factors are very important for the younger generation to have thought about funding retirement. And these are basically the characteristics of how one sees their economic security, for instance, or if you put them together with other age variable and the gender and some household structure, what it actually means is that this indicates where the individual is in terms of the temporal scale of the social aging. So I thought this was a very interesting finding as well. Putting together with other findings that we haven't actually covered in this presentation, basically the study suggests that saving decision is a very, it's a complex interplay between the external and internal factors. And what does that then mean? Is that we cannot actually look at retirement saving decision in isolation in either income or myopia or something, financial literacy, and so on. That we need to actually take a rather holistic approach for balancing the needs for today and for tomorrow. And I think this is precisely the reason why that increasing state pension entitlement will not solve the problem of long-term saving for the younger generation. And another side of this, very important, I think we need to talk about, is the socioeconomic factors that we've just explored, the homeownership, earnings, income, household income, and the availability of intergenerational transfers. These are the characteristics that we know are extremely inequally distributed among the younger generation. And the extent of inequality is greater for younger cohorts than the older cohorts, which means that this inequality is going to be transmitted to the financial resilience and to the long-term saving behaviors. So I think in this regard, policies need to be forward-looking and take these other mechanisms that actually also play together in the context of retirement saving. In other studies, we looked at how younger people actually accumulate wealth, and what we do are very similar to what the previous generation did, putting a lot of effort into what we consider safe, so defined benefit contribution and housing wealth. So our retirement saving portfolio, when we look at as a whole, is very, very similar to the previous generation, yet we are actually facing a very different pension landscape. So in a way that we find this age group somehow stuck in between transition, and the behavioral response that the government wants or would like to have for the ideal situation is somewhat lagged. And this led me to consider whether we need to reframe what we used to think as retirement saving somewhat differently for this population. But with this question, I will just end the presentation and welcome the questions. As I mentioned, this presentation is based on the paper that's recently published. It's open access, so anyone can download it. And I will welcome any comments and questions. If not in the Q&A, then through an email. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ellie. Perfect timing. And thank you even more so for presenting those fascinating findings in a way that I think those of us without your kind of quantitative skill could understand. So thank you, and appreciate that for your valiant efforts in presenting that in a comprehensible way for us non-experts. I'm sure there's lots of questions. I certainly have lots of questions, but I will